Step out of the car now. The officer's voice was sharp, almost snarling. He had one hand resting on the butt of his gun, and his piercing gaze locked on the man standing before him. The man's face remained calm, but the officer's words carried venom. "Do you know who I am?" The man asked, his tone steady, almost too calm given the circumstances. The officer sneered. "I don't care who you are. Hands on the car. Now." The man let out a slow breath, then reached into his jacket pocket. The officer's hand tensed over his holstered weapon. "Don't try anything stupid." Pulling out a sleek leather badge holder, the man opened it. A gold badge glinted under the harsh street lights. The officer froze as his eyes scanned the credentials. Head of Internal Affairs, Police Department. For a moment there was silence. The officer's smug expression melted into shock, then fear. He stumbled over his words. I didn't realize." "Clearly," the man said coolly, "and we're going to talk about what just happened, in great detail." The tension hummed thick in the air. The officer's face paled, and beads of sweat formed on his brow. What was going to happen next? The day had started uneventfully. Thomas Bradley was used to long days at the office, balancing investigations and mediating internal disputes. As the head of Internal Affairs, he had made a name for himself as a no-nonsense leader who didn't tolerate corruption or misconduct. That evening, Thomas decided to leave the office earlier than usual. His wife, Cheryl, had been asking him to spend more time at home, and he figured a quiet dinner with her would be a welcome change. Driving his sleek black sedan, he navigated the winding streets of the suburban neighborhood. Thomas had no idea the evening would take such a turn. As he approached a stoplight near a gas station, flashing red and blue lights erupted behind him. Glancing in his rearview mirror, he saw the patrol car, its lights bouncing off the dimly lit road. He pulled over, assuming it was a routine stop. He had nothing to worry about, or so he thought. The officer approached the car, his flashlight beaming into Thomas's window. He tapped the glass sharply. "License and registration." Thomas complied, handing over his documents. The officer didn't even glance at them before stepping back, muttering something into his radio. Moments later, he returned, his demeanor more aggressive. "Step out of the car." "Is there a problem, officer?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "I said step out." The officer barked, his hand already inching toward his weapon. Thomas's mind raced. This wasn't a standard traffic stop. Something about the officer's tone, his posture, it reeked of bias and intimidation. But Thomas knew better than to escalate the situation. He slowly opened the door and stepped out. The officer's eyes started over Thomas, and his lips curled into a sneer. "Where are you coming from? You don't look like you belong around here." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I live nearby." "Yeah, you don't seem like the type." The underlying implication was clear. Thomas had encountered this kind of prejudice before, but it still stung. He remained silent, waiting for the officer to make his next move. The man circled him, scrutinizing every detail of his appearance, his tailored suit, his polished shoes. "Got anything on you I should know about?" the officer asked. "No. Mind if I check?" It wasn't a question. Thomas felt his patience wearing thin. "I do mind. Unless you have probable cause, you can't search me." The officer's jaw tightened. He clearly wasn't used to being challenged. "You've got a smart mouth for someone in your position." "And what position is that?" Thomas asked, his voice steady. "Someone who's about to have a very bad night." That's when Thomas decided it was time to pull rank. He reached into his jacket, retrieving his badge. The officer's demeanor changed in an instant, his arrogance evaporating as he realized the gravity of his mistake. Now Thomas stood firm, watching the officer squirm under his gaze. The tables had turned. "Let me get this straight," Thomas began. "You pulled me over, ignored my documents, and escalated without cause. Then you made assumptions about me based on nothing more than your own bias." The officer stammered. I didn't realize you were." Thomas cut him off. Does it matter who I am? Would you have treated me differently if I wasn't wearing this suit? If I wasn't carrying this badge?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Give me your name and badge number," Thomas said firmly. The officer hesitated but knew he had no choice. "Officer Mark Evans, badge 1475. Thomas wrote it down, his mind already racing with how he would handle this situation. His years in internal affairs had shown him that systemic change only came when people were held accountable. This officer had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. But before Thomas could say another word, the faint crackle of a police radio interrupted them. A dispatcher's urgent voice came through, reporting a nearby armed robbery. The officer glanced at his patrol car, visibly torn. Thomas folded his arms. "What's it going to be, Officer Evans? Are you going to do your job, or are we going to keep standing here?" The officer swallowed hard, nodding as he hurried back to his car. But as Thomas watched him leave, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The night wasn't over yet. Thomas stood by the side of the road, the fading red and blue lights reflecting off his car as Officer Evans sped away toward the robbery call. The officer's hurried departure left a bitter taste in his mouth. He wasn't one to let things slide, especially when it came to abuse of power. He took out his phone and dialed a number. The voice on the other end answered quickly. "Detective Harris speaking." "Harris, it's Bradley," Thomas said. "I need you to pull up everything you can on an Officer Mark Evans, badge number 1475. Something's not sitting right with me." "Got it," Harris replied. "You okay, boss? You don't usually call this late." "Just an incident I need to follow up on," Thomas said curtly. "Let me know what you find." He hung up, climbed back into his car, and sat there for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The anger simmered just below the surface, but he couldn't let it cloud his judgment. He had spent years building a reputation as someone who didn't act impulsively. He would handle this by the book. Pulling out onto the road, he resumed his drive home. The quiet streets and dim glow of streetlights did little to calm him. His thoughts raced, replaying every moment of the encounter. The officer's smug expression, his hostile tone. It all felt too familiar. Thomas knew this wasn't an isolated incident. For every confrontation like this, there were countless others that never came to light. As he pulled into his driveway, Cheryl was already standing at the front door, her arms crossed and a concerned look on her face. "You're late," she said softly. "Everything okay?" Thomas gave her a small smile. "Just work stuff. Nothing to worry about." She stepped aside to let him in, but her eyes lingered on his face, searching for answers he wasn't ready to give. "You've got that look, Tom." "What look?" he asked, feigning ignorance. "The look that says something happened, and you're going to lose sleep over it." He sighed, knowing she could see right through him. "Let's talk about it tomorrow. I'm starving. What's for dinner?" Cheryl didn't press further, though he could tell she wanted to. Instead, she nodded toward the kitchen. "Lasagna. Your favorite." The smell of garlic and melted cheese filled the air, momentarily lifting his spirits. He sat down at the dining table, trying to focus on the simple pleasure of a home-cooked meal. But even as he ate, the incident loomed large in his mind. The next morning, Thomas was back in his office earlier than usual. He had barely settled into his chair when Harris walked in holding a manila folder. "Got everything you asked for," Harris said, placing the folder on Thomas's desk. "You're going to want to take a look at this." Thomas opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. Officer Evans had a troubling record. Multiple complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct were listed. Yet every complaint had been dismissed or marked unsubstantiated. "This guy's been skating by for years," Harris said, shaking his head. "You'd think with a file like this, someone would take an action." Thomas frowned. "Someone should have. And now it's on us." Harris leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "What's the play here, boss? We go straight to the chief, or do you want to dig deeper?" Thomas tapped the folder with his fingers, his mind already formulating a plan. We dig deeper. I want to know why he's still on the force and who's been covering for him. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about the system that keeps him in uniform. Harris nodded. Understood. I'll start pulling up his cases, see if there's a pattern. As Harris left, Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring at the folder. He had seen cases like this before, where systemic issues allowed bad behavior to persist. But this time it felt personal. Evans had crossed the wrong person, and Thomas wasn't going to let it slide. Later that day, Thomas received a call from one of his informants. A gruff voice came through the line. Heard you had a run-in with Evans last night. Thomas's grip on the phone tightened. Word travels fast. Evans is trouble, Bradley. He's got friends in high places, people who keep him protected. You start poking around and they're not going to like it. Good, Thomas said coldly. Maybe it's time someone made them uncomfortable. The informant chuckled. You've got guts, I'll give you that. Just watch your back. The line went dead, leaving Thomas with more questions than answers. Who was protecting Evans and why? That evening, as Thomas drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. A dark SUV had been trailing him for several blocks, matching his turns and maintaining a steady distance. He glanced in his rearview mirror, his senses on high alert. Pulling into a gas station, he decided to test his theory. He parked by the pumps and waited. The SUV slowed as it passed, then continued down the road. But Thomas wasn't convinced. He pulled out onto the street again, taking a different route home. As he neared his neighborhood, the SUV reappeared, this time pulling up alongside him at a stoplight. The tinted window rolled down just enough for him to see a shadowy figure inside. A low voice called out, "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Bradley. Drop it." Before Thomas could respond, the SUV sped off, its taillights disappearing into the night. His heart raced, but his resolve only grew stronger. Whoever was behind this wanted him to back down. That meant he was onto something big. This was no longer just about Officer Evans. It was about uncovering the rot that allowed officers like him to thrive. And Thomas wasn't going to stop until he got to the bottom of it. Thomas's mind was spinning as he parked his car in the driveway. The warning from the shadowy figure in the SUV only fueled his determination. Whoever was trying to intimidate him clearly had something to hide, and Thomas wasn't about to let them get away with it. Cheryl was waiting for him at the door again, her arms crossed and a worried look etched on her face. "What's going on, Tom? You've been distracted since last night." He hesitated, knowing she wouldn't let it go this time. "Something happened. I had a run-in with a cop last night, and it's turned into something bigger than I expected." Her eyes widened. "What kind of run-in? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he reassured her. "But the officer, Evans, he's dirty, and it looks like there's a whole network protecting him." Cheryl shook her head, her concern deepening. "And now they're coming after you." "I can handle it," he said, though the memory of the SUV still sent a chill down his spine. "You know this is what I do. I can't let this go." She sighed, placing a hand on his arm. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," he said, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. The next morning, Thomas returned to the office with a renewed sense of purpose. Harris was already waiting for him, a stack of files in hand. "You're not going to believe this," Harris said, dropping the files onto Thomas's desk. "I've been digging into Evans's cases. Not only has he been protected, but a lot of the complaints against him were filed by the same group of people." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's a pattern," Harris explained. "He targets specific neighborhoods, mostly Black and Latino communities, and when people file complaints, they get mysteriously dropped or lost in the system." Thomas flipped through the files, his jaw tightening as he read the details. False arrests, excessive force, racial slurs, it was all there. Yet every case had been swept under the rug. "Who's behind this?" Thomas asked, his voice low. "I don't have names yet, but I've found a few connections," Harris said. "Evans's precinct commander, Captain Rowe, has been signing off on the dismissals." And get this, Rose got ties to a couple of city council members. Looks like a lot of favors are being traded. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. This wasn't just about Evans. It was about a system that enabled officers like him to operate with impunity. Keep digging, Thomas said. I want everything you can find on Rowe and anyone connected to him. Harris nodded and left the room, leaving Thomas to his thoughts. The scope of the problem was bigger than he had anticipated, but that only made him more determined to see it through. That evening, as Thomas reviewed the files in his home office, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. Thomas stared at the message, his pulse quickening. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare him. They were escalating. He took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it to Harris, along with a simple note, "Trace this." His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. The same unknown number flashed on the screen. Against his better judgment, he answered. Bradley, the voice on the other end said, low and menacing, "You don't know who you're dealing with. Then why don't you enlighten me?" Thomas replied, keeping his voice steady. There was a pause, then a chuckle. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a cog in the machine, and we can replace you anytime we want." The line went dead, leaving Thomas gripping the phone tightly. He refused to let fear control him, but the message was clear. The people protecting Evans were powerful, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got in their way. The next day, Harris called Thomas into his office, his expression grim. "We've got a problem. I traced the number from the text message. It's registered to a burner phone, but the location data shows it came from inside the precinct." Thomas' eyes narrowed. Someone in the department is involved. Harris nodded. And not just anyone. The signal bounced through a secured server that only high-ranking officers have access to. Rowe, Thomas said, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "It's possible," Harris agreed. "But there's more. I did some digging into Rowe's financials. He's got a lot of unexplained income, and most of it seems to be coming from contracts tied to city council projects." Thomas's mind raced. This wasn't just about police misconduct. It was about corruption at the highest levels of local government. That evening, Thomas decided to pay a visit to one of the neighborhoods Evans frequently targeted. He wanted to hear from the people directly affected by the officers' actions. As he parked his car on a quiet street, he noticed a group of residents gathered outside a corner store. Approaching cautiously, he introduced himself. "My name's Thomas Bradley. I'm with Internal Affairs. I'm looking into Officer Evans." The group exchanged wary glances before an older man stepped forward. "You're brave coming here and saying that name. Evans has made life hell for us. People have stopped reporting him because nothing ever happens." "Not this time," Thomas assured him. "But I need your help. I need to know everything he's done here." The man nodded, and over the next hour, Thomas listened to stories of harassment, false arrests, and violence. It was a damning account, but it was exactly what he needed to build his case. As he walked back to his car, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He glanced around, the street eerily quiet. Too quiet. Before he could react, the roar of an engine cut through the silence. A black SUV screeched around the corner, its headlights bearing down on him. Thomas barely had time to dive out of the way as the vehicle sped past, missing him by inches. It disappeared into the night, leaving him shaken but unharmed. Lying on the ground, his heart pounding, Thomas knew one thing for sure. The people protecting Evans weren't just playing games anymore. They wanted him out of the way, and they were willing to kill to make it happen. Thomas scrambled to his feet, his pulse still racing from the near miss. He brushed the dirt off his suit and glanced up and down the street, but the SUV was long gone. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone to call Harris. "Harris," Thomas said, his voice tight. "Someone just tried to run me down. Black SUV, no plates." There was a pause on the other end, and then Harris's voice came through, steady but tense. "Where are you?" "Crestwood neighborhood. I was talking to residents about Evans." "Get out of there now," Harris said. I'll send a unit your way to escort you home. No, Thomas said firmly. If they're watching me, they'll see the patrol car and know we're onto them. I'll handle this. Boss, you can't do this alone. I'm not alone, Thomas said, though the words felt hollow. Just keep digging. We need to hit them before they hit us again. He hung up, climbed into his car, and drove off, taking an indirect route to shake off any potential tail. Every turn, every set of headlights behind him felt like a threat. By the time he reached home, he was exhausted but resolute. The next morning, Thomas called an emergency meeting with Harris and a few trusted members of his team. They gathered in a secure conference room, the air heavy with tension. Whoever's protecting Evans tried to send me a message last night, Thomas began. They're getting desperate, which means we're getting close. Harris spoke up. We've connected the dots between Rowe and several council members. They've been funneling money through fake contracts and using Evans to keep certain neighborhoods under control. It's a power play: control the streets, control the voters. Thomas nodded. And they're using the precinct as their enforcement arm. This isn't just corruption, it's organized crime. One of the team members, Detective Lopez, raised a hand. If Rowe's the linchpin, why not go after him directly? Because we need evidence that can't be buried, Thomas said. If we move too soon, they'll close ranks and we'll lose our chance to take them all down. Lopez leaned back, a look of grim understanding on her face. So, what's the plan? We build an airtight case, Thomas said. Interviews, surveillance, financial records. We gather enough evidence to blow this wide open. And we move quickly, because they won't stop coming after us. As the team dispersed to start their work, Thomas sat alone in the conference room, staring at the evidence they'd gathered so far. It was damning, but not enough to take down a network this entrenched. He needed more, and he knew exactly where to get it. That evening, Thomas paid a visit to a retired officer named Ray Bennett, who had worked in the same precinct as Evans years ago. Ray had left the force under suspicious circumstances, and Thomas suspected he might know something. Ray's small house was tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place where neighbors kept to themselves. When Thomas knocked on the door, it creaked open, and a gruff voice called out, "Who's there?" "Thomas Bradley, Internal Affairs." The door opened wider, revealing a wiry man with a weathered face. He looked Thomas up and down, his expression guarded. "What do you want?" "To talk about Evans and Rowe." Ray's eyes narrowed. "That's a dangerous subject." Thomas stepped inside, lowering his voice. "I think you know why I'm here. I need information, and I need it now." Ray sighed and motioned for Thomas to sit. "I knew this day would come. Evans and Rowe, they're two sides of the same coin. Rowe keeps Evans on a leash, and Evans does his dirty work. I saw things that made me walk away." "Like what?" Thomas pressed. Ray hesitated, glancing around as if the walls had ears. They had a network: drug deals, bribes, intimidation. Anyone who got in their way either backed down or disappeared. I tried to report it, but Rowe shut me down, said I was misremembering. Next thing I know, my career's over. Thomas leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Ray shook his head. "Nothing solid, but I know where you can find it." "Rowe has a storage unit. He used to brag about keeping records, just in case," he said. "If those records are still there, they'll have everything you need." Thomas's heart raced. This could be the break they needed. "Where is it?" Ray scribbled an address on a scrap of paper. "Be careful. If they catch you, they won't hesitate." Armed with the address, Thomas returned to the office and shared the lead with Harris. "This could be it," Harris said, his excitement barely contained. "If we get those records, we can take down the whole operation." Thomas nodded. "We'll need to move carefully. I want surveillance on the storage unit before we go in. If they're watching it, we'll need a backup plan." Harris agreed and started making arrangements. But as Thomas prepared for the operation, a gnawing sense of unease settled in his gut. He knew they were walking into dangerous territory, and the stakes couldn't be higher. That night, as Thomas sat in his office reviewing the plan, his phone buzzed. Another unknown number. Bradley, the voice on the line said, cold and menacing. You think you're smart, don't you? Poking around where you don't belong. Why don't you come and tell me that in person? Thomas shot back, his patience wearing thin. The voice chuckled. Oh, we'll meet soon enough, but not on your terms. The call ended abruptly, leaving Thomas gripping his phone tightly. He knew the warning wasn't idle. Whoever was behind this was playing for keeps. 2 days later, the team prepared to move on the storage unit. Surveillance had shown no activity, and Thomas decided it was time to act. Dressed in plain clothes, he and Harris approached the unit under cover of darkness. As Harris picked the lock, Thomas kept watch, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. The lock clicked open, and they stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The room was filled with boxes and filing cabinets. Thomas's heart pounded as he opened the first drawer, finding stacks of documents detailing payouts, fake contracts, and lists of names. This is it, Harris said, his voice barely above a whisper. We've got them. But before they could celebrate, the sound of tires screeching outside made them freeze. Flashlights beamed through the cracks in the door, and muffled voices shouted orders. They're here, Harris said, drawing his weapon. Thomas nodded, his adrenaline spiking. They were trapped, and the people outside weren't here to talk. Thomas and Harris exchanged tense glances as the shouting outside grew louder. The storage unit was their sanctuary for only a few moments longer. They had evidence in their hands that could dismantle a web of corruption, but now they were cornered. Drop everything and come out slowly, a voice commanded from outside. It was deep, authoritative, and left no room for negotiation. Harris's grip tightened on his weapon. They're not regular cops. No way they're calling this in. Thomas nodded, his mind racing for options. We can't let them have these files. If they get in, this whole thing goes away. Harris scanned the room. Back entrance? Thomas shook his head. No time to find one. We need a diversion. He grabbed one of the lighter boxes, opened it, and began tearing the papers apart. If they think we're destroying the evidence, they'll rush in. That'll give us a window. You're crazy, Harris muttered, but he knew there wasn't another option. He took a match from his pocket, a habit from a long-past smoking phase, and struck it against the box. The corner of the papers caught fire, the flame crackling and spreading quickly. The voices outside grew frantic. They're burning the evidence. Move in. Thomas and Harris braced themselves as the door burst open, metal screeching against concrete. 3 men in tactical gear stormed in, guns drawn. They weren't wearing police uniforms. Their faces were masked, and their movements were precise. Professionals. Drop the files now, one of the men barked. Thomas raised his hand slightly, the files clutched in one hand. You don't want to do this. You don't know who I am. We know exactly who you are, Bradley, the man replied. And we're here to make sure you don't cause any more problems. Harris acted first. He threw a heavy metal file cabinet toward the closest attacker. The clang echoing through the storage unit. It didn't hit, but it gave them the split second they needed. Thomas dove behind a stack of boxes while Harris fired a warning shot, his aim just enough to make the men hesitate. Move, Thomas shouted. They bolted toward the rear of the unit, dodging as bullets zipped past them. The masked men weren't trying to arrest them. They were trying to kill them. Thomas knew their orders were to eliminate witnesses and recover the evidence. Thomas and Harris found a back door, partially blocked by a pile of junk. They pushed through, emerging into the cold night air. They sprinted toward the dark alley behind the storage facility, their breaths coming in sharp gasps. Do you have the files? Harris asked, glancing over at his shoulder. Thomas clutched a single folder tightly to his chest. Enough to blow this wide open, but we need to get out of here. The sound of footsteps and shouting grew closer. They couldn't outrun these men forever, not without a plan. Thomas spotted a narrow staircase leading to the roof of an adjacent building. Up there, he said, pointing. They climbed quickly, the metal staircase creaking under their weight. Once on the roof, they crouched behind a large ventilation unit, catching their breath. The men below fanned out, their flashlights sweeping the area. "They're not giving up," Harris muttered. "We need backup." Thomas pulled out his phone and dialed a secure line to their team's dispatcher. "This is Bradley. We need immediate extraction at the storage facility. Hostiles in pursuit, armed and dangerous." "Understood," the dispatcher replied. "ETA 5 minutes." "We don't have 5 minutes," Harris said, peeking over the edge of the roof. The men below were circling the building, their movements methodical. Thomas knew they had to hold their position until help arrived. He opened the folder, quickly scanning the contents. "This is it," he whispered, his eyes widening. "Contracts, payments, names, it's all here." "Then we can't lose it," Harris said. "Whatever happens, we get out of here alive." The sound of tires screeching signaled reinforcements. 2 unmarked vehicles pulled up, and several of Thomas's team members emerged, weapons drawn. The men below immediately turned their attention to the newcomers, a tense standoff erupting in the alley. "Bradley, we've got you covered," one of the team members shouted. "Get down here." Thomas and Harris climbed back down the staircase, staying low as bullets ricocheted off the metal. Their team provided suppressing fire, forcing the masked men to retreat. As soon as they reached the ground, Thomas handed the folder to Lopes, who had arrived with the team. "Secure this. Make copies. This is the key." Lopes nodded, tucking the folder into her jacket. "What about them?" she asked, nodding toward the masked men who were now retreating into the shadows. "They're not done with us yet," Thomas said grimly. "But we've got the upper hand now." Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was electric. The team pored over the documents, piecing together the full extent of the corruption. The evidence pointed directly to Captain Rowe and his network of allies, including several high-ranking officials. "This is bigger than we thought," Harris said, flipping through the files. "They've been running this operation for years. Drugs, extortion, voter suppression. It's all connected." Thomas nodded, his expression resolute. "We take this to the district attorney first thing in the morning. This ends now." But as he spoke, his phone buzzed with another text message. This time it wasn't a threat. It was a single name. Rowe. Thomas stared at the screen, his mind racing. Whoever sent the message was on the inside, and they wanted him to know Rowe was the linchpin. But the question lingered. Why were they helping him? And how much danger were they in now that they had the evidence? The room fell silent as Thomas shared the message with the team. "Someone's tipping us off." "But why?" "Could be someone looking to save their own skin," Lopes suggested. "Or someone who knows Rowe's gone too far." Thomas wasn't convinced. Whoever was feeding them information was playing a dangerous game, and he wasn't sure if they could be trusted. "We stay on high alert," he said. "No one moves alone, and no one talks to anyone outside this room until we've got Rowe in custody." The team nodded, their determination mirroring his own. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. Somewhere out there, Rowe was watching, waiting, and planning his next move. And Thomas knew the next strike would be even more dangerous. The air in the precinct was heavy with tension. Every passing second felt like a countdown to an unseen clock, ticking toward whatever Captain Rowe and his network would do next. The team worked tirelessly, securing the evidence, cross-referencing the names, and preparing a case solid enough to bring down the entire operation. Thomas sat at his desk, staring at the message on his phone. Rowe. The sender had yet to reveal themselves, but their message had provided the clarity he needed. Rowe was the center of this storm. If they could take him down, the whole operation would crumble. But why would someone on the inside risk exposing Rowe? What did they stand to gain or lose? These questions nagged at Thomas, but he couldn't dwell on them. He had to stay focused. The next morning, Thomas and Harris met with the district attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Morgan. She examined the evidence, her expression growing more serious with each page she turned. "This is damning," Morgan said finally. "If this gets out, it's going to shake the entire department." "That's the idea," Thomas replied. But we need to move quickly. Rowe's not going to sit back and let us take him down. Morgan nodded. I'll prepare a warrant for his arrest. We'll raid his office and seize anything else he's hiding. Thomas leaned forward. We'll need to coordinate with officers we can trust. If anyone loyal to Rowe gets wind of this, he'll destroy the remaining evidence. I'll handle that, Morgan assured him. But you need to be ready. Once this starts, there's no turning back. Back at the precinct, Thomas called the team together. We've got the DA on board. The warrant's being processed as we speak. This is our chance to take Rowe down. The team's energy was palpable. They knew the risks, but they were united in their resolve. What about the informant? Lopez asked. Have they reached out again? Thomas shook his head. Not yet. But whoever they are, they've pointed us in the right direction. Let's make sure their risk wasn't for nothing. The raid was scheduled for the following morning. Thomas spent the night reviewing the plan, going over every detail to ensure nothing could go wrong. But as he sat in his dimly lit office, a sense of unease crept over him. His phone buzzed. Another text from the same unknown number. He knows. Thomas's heart sank. Rowe was aware of their plans. The operation was already compromised. He immediately called Harris. Get everyone back to the precinct now. Rowe knows we're coming. How? Harris asked, his voice sharp with alarm. Someone tipped him off, Thomas said. We need to regroup and figure out our next move. Within an hour, the team was assembled in the secure conference room. Thomas paced as he explained the situation. Rowe has allies everywhere. We have to assume he's destroyed anything incriminating in his office. But that doesn't mean we're out of options. Harris spoke up. We still have the storage unit files. That's enough to arrest him and start peeling back the layers of this operation. Lopes nodded. But if Rowe knows we're coming, you won't go quietly. He'll dig in or run. Thomas glanced at the folder on the table. Then we don't give him the chance. We hit him tonight, before he has time to regroup. The team agreed, their resolve unshaken. But as they finalized the plan, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The raid began just after midnight. Thomas, Harris, and a small team of trusted officers arrived at Rowe's house, a sprawling suburban property surrounded by a high fence. They moved quickly, cutting the lock on the gate and approaching the front door. Thomas signaled to the team. On my count. 3, 2, 1. The door burst open, and the team swept inside, their weapons drawn. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the creak of their boots on the hardwood floors. Clear. One officer called from the living room. Clear. Another shouted from the kitchen. Thomas and Harris moved upstairs, checking each room methodically. When they reached the master bedroom, the door was ajar. Thomas pushed it open, his weapon ready. The room was empty, except for a laptop on the bed, its screen glowing. On it was a simple message. Too slow, Bradley. Thomas's jaw tightened. He's gone. Harris cursed under his breath. How did he know? Thomas shook his head. Doesn't matter. He's on the run, and that makes him dangerous. As the team regrouped outside, a call came in over the radio. All units be advised. A vehicle matching Captain Rowe's description has been spotted heading south on I-95. Thomas' adrenaline surged. That's our lead. Let's move. He and Harris jumped into their vehicle, their sirens blaring as they raced toward the highway. The chase was on. Rowe's SUV was weaving through traffic at high speed, its taillights disappearing and reappearing in the distance. Thomas gripped the wheel tightly, pushing the car to its limits as they closed the gap. We can't let him slip away, Harris said, his voice tense. We won't, Thomas replied, his focus razor-sharp. As they approached an overpass, Rowe's SUV suddenly veered onto an exit ramp, nearly colliding with another car. Thomas followed, his tires screeching as he took the turn. Rowe was heading toward an industrial area, the roads narrowing and becoming more desolate. It was the perfect place for an ambush or a last stand. Thomas and Harris caught up to the SUV as it screeched to a halt outside an abandoned warehouse. Rowe jumped out, a gun in his hand, and bolted inside. "He's armed," Harris shouted as they exited their vehicle. Thomas motioned for the team to follow, his heart pounding. The warehouse loomed ahead at his broken windows and rusted metal walls casting ominous shadows. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Rowe's footsteps echoed faintly as he moved deeper into the building. Thomas signaled for the team to spread out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Rowe," Thomas called. "It's over. You can't run from this." A gunshot rang out, the sound reverberating through the cavernous space. The team dropped to cover, their weapons drawn. Thomas's voice was steady as he called out again. "You're only making this worse for yourself. Surrender now, and you might have a chance to explain." Rowe's voice came from the shadows, cold and defiant. "You don't get it, Bradley. This isn't about me. You've opened a door you can't close." Another shot rang out, this one striking a metal beam near Thomas's head. He crouched lower, his heart pounding. Rowe was cornered, but he wasn't going down without a fight. The warehouse was a labyrinth of shadows and echoes. Thomas crouched behind a stack of crates, his flashlight casting faint beams into the darkness. Rowe was somewhere ahead, armed and desperate, his voice still ringing in Thomas's ears. "You think taking me down will fix this?" Rowe shouted, his voice bouncing off the walls. "You're too late. The machine's already in motion." Thomas scanned the area, his senses heightened. Harris and the other officers were fanned out, moving cautiously through the space. Every creak, every shift of the air felt like a potential threat. "You've got nowhere to go, Rowe," Thomas called out. "Drop the weapon and come out with your hands up." Another shot cracked through the air, this one striking a crate inches from Harris's head. He ducked behind a pillar, cursing under his breath. "He's trying to draw us out," Harris said, his voice low. "He knows this place better than we do." Thomas nodded, motioning for the team to stay low. "We flush him out, but no one takes a shot unless it's absolutely necessary. We eat him alive." The team moved in tandem, their steps deliberate and silent. Thomas's flashlight caught a glint of metal on the far side of the room, a ladder leading to a rusted catwalk overhead. His gut told him Rowe had taken the high ground. "Cover me," Thomas whispered to Harris as he approached the ladder. He climbed quickly but quietly, the metal rungs cold and slick under his hands. At the top, the catwalk stretched out like a narrow bridge, creaking with every step. He moved slowly, his weapon raised, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Then he heard it, the faint scuff of a boot on metal. Rowe was close. "End of the line, Rowe," Thomas shouted. "You don't have to die here. Put the gun down." A figure emerged from the shadows, Rowe's face illuminated by the beam of Thomas's flashlight. His gun was still in his hand, his eyes wild and defiant. "You think you've won, Bradley," Rowe said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a pawn. You don't even know what you're up against." Thomas kept his weapon trained on him. "Then why don't you tell me? What's so big that you're willing to destroy your life to protect it?" Rowe smirked. "You wouldn't understand. You're too blinded by your so-called justice." He raised his gun, and for a split second, Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. But before Rowe could fire, Harris appeared below, his own weapon aimed upward. "Drop it, Rowe," Harris barked. "This is your last chance." Rowe hesitated, his grip faltering. The realization that he was cornered seemed to sink in. He let out a bitter laugh, the sound echoing eerily through the warehouse. "You think you've got me," Rowe said, lowering the gun slightly. "But you've only scratched the surface. You'll see." Before Thomas could respond, Rowe dropped his weapon and raised his hands. Harris and another officer rushed up the stairs, securing him in handcuffs. Rowe didn't resist, his expression one of resigned arrogance. Back at the precinct, Rowe was placed in an interrogation room. Thomas watched him through the one-way glass, his mind racing with questions. Rowe's cryptic words still lingered. What had he meant by the machine? Harris entered the observation room, his face grim. "He's not going to talk unless we push hard." Thomas nodded. "Let me handle it." Rowe sat at the table, his hands cuffed in front of him. His calm demeanor was unsettling, as if he had expected all of this. Thomas sat across from him, his voice steady but firm. "You're facing a long list of charges. Corruption, racketeering, conspiracy, you name it. But if you cooperate, there's a chance we can work something out." Rowe leaned back in his chair, smirking. "You think I care about saving myself? I think you care about the people who will be exposed when we take this to court," Thomas countered. "You're the linchpin, but you're not the top of the chain. Someone's pulling your strings." Rowe's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something else: fear. Thomas seized on it. "Who's behind this? Who's the machine?" Rowe shook his head. "Even if I told you, it wouldn't matter. They're bigger than you. Bigger than any of us." "Try me," Thomas pressed. Rowe leaned forward, his voice low. "You think this city's dirty cops are the problem? They're just tools. The real power is higher up. Politicians, business leaders, people with the resources to bury you before you can blink." "Names," Thomas demanded. Rowe laughed bitterly. "You won't get them from me. But I'll give you this: look into the contracts tied to the airport expansion project. That's where the money flows. Follow the money and you'll find the machine." After hours of interrogation, Rowe was taken to a secure holding cell. Thomas relayed the information to the team, who immediately began digging into the airport project. What they found confirmed Rowe's warning. The project was riddled with shady deals, inflated contracts, and payments to shell companies. Several prominent city officials were implicated, their names appearing repeatedly in the financial records. "This is huge," Harris said, his eyes wide. "If we take this to the DA, it could blow the entire operation wide open." Thomas nodded, his resolve unwavering. "But it also puts targets on our backs. Rowe was right about one thing: this goes higher than we thought." That night, as Thomas drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. "You've found the machine. Be careful, it's watching you too." Thomas's grip tightened on the wheel. The battle was far from over. They had uncovered a massive conspiracy, but exposing it would come at a cost. He could feel the weight of the fight ahead, but he wasn't about to back down. The machine was watching, but so was he. Thomas couldn't sleep that night. The text message replayed in his mind like a warning bell. "You found the machine. Be careful, it's watching you too." The stakes were higher than ever. They weren't just fighting a corrupt officer or even a corrupt precinct. This was a tangled web of power and influence, and one wrong move could cost them everything. By dawn, Thomas was back at the precinct. Harris and the rest of the team were already digging into the airport expansion project, their desks cluttered with documents, spreadsheets, and photos of key players. "We've got a lead," Harris said, motioning Thomas over. "The contracts Rowe mentioned, they tie back to a company called Westford Dynamics. On paper, they're a construction firm, but they've got no actual projects. It's a front." "For what?" Thomas asked. Harris handed him a file. "Money laundering. They're funneling funds through Westford to pay off city officials and other key players. And here's the kicker: the board of directors includes 3 sitting members of the city council." Thomas's jaw tightened. "We need to get this to Morgan. If we can prove the council members are involved, we can bring the whole operation crashing down." Thomas and Harris met with District Attorney Morgan later that morning. She studied the evidence carefully, her expression growing grimmer with each passing minute. "This is explosive," Morgan said, setting the file down. "If we take this public, it'll send shockwaves through the entire city." "That's the idea," Thomas replied. "But we need to act fast. If they catch wind of what we have, they'll bury it." Morgan nodded. "I'll authorize warrants for the council members and anyone else tied to Westford Dynamics. But this is going to be messy, Thomas. These people have deep pockets and friends in high places. They won't go down without a fight." As the team prepared for the operation, tension filled the air. They knew they were about to take on some of the most powerful people in the city. Every detail had to be perfect. Thomas gathered the team in the conference room for one final briefing. "This isn't just about taking down Rowe or Evans. This is about dismantling a system that's been corrupt for years. We've got one shot at this, and we can't afford to miss." The team nodded, their resolve clear. They were ready. The raids began just after sunset. Thomas and Harris led the operation at the home of one of the city council members, a man named Victor Langley. Langley had been instrumental in approving the airport expansion project and had personally signed off on several contracts tied to Westford Dynamics. The team arrived at Langley's sprawling estate, their vehicles pulling up silently along the tree-lined driveway. Thomas motioned for the team to surround the house before he approached the front door. "Victor Langley, this is internal affairs. We have a warrant for your arrest. Open the door," Thomas shouted. For a moment there was silence. Then the faint sound of footsteps echoed inside. Thomas signaled to the team, and they breached the door. Inside, Langley was frantically stuffing papers into a briefcase. When he saw the officers, he froze, his face pale. "Hands where I can see them," Thomas ordered. Langley hesitated, then raised his hands. "You don't know what you're doing. If you take me down, you're only scratching the surface." Thomas approached, his eyes narrowing. "Then help us dig deeper. Who else is involved?" Langley's lips tightened, and he shook his head. "You think I'm going to talk? If I do, I'm as good as dead." "We can protect you," Thomas said, though he wasn't sure how true that was. Langley let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea what you're up against." As Langley was taken into custody, Thomas's phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "They're coming." Thomas's heart sank. He turned to Harris. "Get the evidence out of here. Now, if they're coming for us, we can't let them get their hands on it." Harris nodded, quickly securing the briefcase and other files they had seized. Moments later, the faint sound of engines roared in the distance. Thomas stepped outside, his hand on his weapon, just as 3 black SUVs pulled up to the estate. Men in tactical gear poured out, their faces obscured by masks. These weren't police. They were hired enforcers, and their intent was clear. "Inside," Thomas shouted. "We're under attack." The officers scrambled for cover as gunfire erupted, bullets shattering windows and ricocheting off walls. Thomas ducked behind a stone pillar, his mind racing. The attackers were relentless, their precision too refined for ordinary thugs. Harris crouched beside him, his weapon drawn. "They're trying to take us out before we can use the evidence." "Not on my watch," Thomas growled. He fired a few shots, forcing the attackers to retreat momentarily. One of the officers managed to radio for backup, but Thomas knew it would take time for reinforcements to arrive. They had to hold their ground. As the firefight raged on, Thomas spotted a figure in the distance. A man standing by one of the SUVs, watching the chaos unfold. He wasn't armed, but his presence exuded authority. Thomas's instincts told him this man was calling the shots. He turned to Harris. "Cover me." "What are you doing?" Harris asked, his voice laced with alarm. "Ending this," Thomas said. He darted through the chaos, weaving between cover as bullets whizzed past him. The man by the SUV saw him coming but didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his hands in his pockets, a faint smile on his lips. As Thomas approached, the man spoke. "You're tenacious, Bradley. I'll give you that." "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, his weapon trained on the man. The man chuckled. "Just a messenger. And the message is this: stop digging or you'll regret it." Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. "You're not walking away from this." The man's smile widened. "You'll find that I don't need to." Before Thomas could react, the man stepped back into the SUV. The vehicle sped away, the other attackers retreating as quickly as they had arrived. The firefight ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only shattered glass and the sound of distant sirens. As backup arrived and secured the scene, Thomas stood in the wreckage, his mind racing. They had survived, but it was clear the machine wasn't going to stop. The stakes had just been raised, and the fight was far from over. The Langley raid had left the team shaken but determined. The shattered glass and bullet-riddled walls of the councilman's estate served as a chilling reminder of the lengths the machine would go to protect itself. Thomas knew they had Pope's sleeping giant, and now it was wide awake. Back at the precinct, the team regrouped. Harris placed the recovered evidence on the table, his hands still trembling slightly. "We've got the files, but that was too close." Thomas nodded, his expression grim. "They're not going to let up. We're officially in their crosshairs." Lopes glanced at the files. "We've got enough to charge Langley and connect him to Westford Dynamics, but if they're willing to send a hit squad, they must think we're close to something bigger." Thomas's phone buzzed with another text. The same unknown number. "You've only seen the tip of the iceberg. Langley isn't the end, he's the beginning." He stared at the message, a chill running down his spine. Whoever this informant was, they seemed to have a front-row seat to the machine's inner workings. Thomas held up the phone. "Our mystery texter isn't done with us yet. They say Langley is just the beginning." Harris frowned. "What does that mean? Who's next?" "We follow the money," Thomas said, his voice resolute. "Langley's tied to Westford Dynamics, and Westford ties to the airport project. We dig deeper into the contracts and find out who else is benefiting." Over the next several days, the team worked around the clock, combing through financial records and surveillance footage. Patterns began to emerge: inflated invoices, payments to offshore accounts, and connections to several high-ranking officials. Among the names was Marion Brooks, a powerful real estate developer with deep ties to the city's political elite. "Brooks has her hands in everything," Harris said, pinning her photo to the evidence board. "Real estate, construction, even campaign financing. If Langley is the architect of this corruption, she's the financier." "She's also untouchable," Lopes added. "She's got an army of lawyers and more connections than we can count. If we go after her, we need an airtight case." Thomas stared at Brooks's photo, his jaw clenched. "We start building it. If she's funding the machine, she's the next target." That evening, as Thomas was heading home, his phone buzzed again. Another message. "Brooks is the key, but she knows you're coming." Thomas stopped in his tracks, glancing around the dark street. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. He quickly forwarded the message to Harris, along with his thoughts. "We need to move fast before she disappears." The next morning, the team prepared for their next move. Using warrants obtained through the DA, they began surveillance on Marion Brooks's properties and businesses. What they uncovered painted a damning picture. Brooks had used her influence to steer city contracts toward companies she controlled, funneling millions into offshore accounts. She had also made significant donations to several council members, including Langley, ensuring their cooperation. "We've got her," Harris said in reviewing the evidence. "This connects her to Langley, Rowe, and Westford Dynamics." Thomas nodded. "Let's bring her in." The raid on Brooks's office was a coordinated effort. Thomas, Harris, and Lopes led the operation, arriving at her downtown high-rise with a team of officers. The building's sleek glass exterior belied the corruption that lay within. Inside, they moved quickly, securing the premises and seizing files and computers. Brooks herself was seated at a massive mahogany desk, her expression calm but defiant. "You're making a mistake," she said as Thomas approached. "I don't think so," Thomas replied. "We have enough evidence to charge you with fraud, bribery, and conspiracy." Brooks smirked. "Do you? Or do you just think you do?" Her confidence unnerved Thomas, but he didn't let it show. "We'll see how confident you are when you're in a holding cell." As officers escorted her out, Brooks leaned in close to Thomas, her voice a low whisper. "You have no idea what you've started. This won't end with me." Back at the precinct, the team began combing through the seized evidence. Among the files was a ledger detailing payments to several officials and businesses. But one entry caught Thomas's eye. A series of payments marked special projects, with dates aligning to key moments in the airport expansion approval process. "What are these?" he asked, pointing to the entries. Lopes shook her head. "No idea. They don't tie directly to Westford or Langley. It's like there's something else entirely." Thomas's phone buzzed. Another message. Special projects are the heart of the machine. You're closer than you think. Thomas showed the team the text. Harris leaned over the ledger, his brow furrowed. If these are separate from the main operation, it means there's another layer we haven't uncovered. Then we find it, Thomas said. Whatever these special projects are, they're important enough to hide. And that means they're important enough to bring down. Late that night, Thomas sat alone in his office, reviewing the ledger again. The numbers blurred as exhaustion set in, but he couldn't stop. He felt like he was on the verge of something big, something that could unravel the entire machine. Suddenly, his computer screen flickered, and an email notification popped up. The sender was anonymous, but the subject line caught his attention. Special projects, see the truth. He opened the email cautiously. Inside was a single link. Against his better judgment, he clicked it, and a document began to download. As the file opened, Thomas's heart sank. The document contained blueprints, financial records, and a list of names, all tied to something called Project Dominion. Before he could process what he was seeing, his phone rang. It was Harris. "Boss, we've got a problem," Harris said, his voice tense. "Brooks just made bail, and she's gone." Thomas clenched his fists, staring at the screen. Project Dominion. Brooks escaping. The machine wasn't just fighting back. It was escalating, and whatever Project Dominion was, it was their next battleground. Thomas sat in his office, the words Project Dominion glaring back at him from the screen. The document was dense with information, blueprints, payment logs, and cryptic notes. But one thing was clear. This was bigger than anything they had uncovered so far. The plans outlined a sprawling infrastructure of influence and control, stretching far beyond the city. Harris barged into the room, his face pale. "Brooks is gone. She had a team waiting for her outside the courthouse. By the time anyone realized what was happening, she was in the wind." Thomas leaned back, rubbing his temples. "She's running because we're close. But this isn't just about her anymore. Look at this." He turned the screen toward Harris, who scanned the document, his expression darkening with every line. "Dominion," Harris muttered. "What the hell is this?" "It's the next level," Thomas said. "Brooks was financing it. Langley was enabling it. And Rowe was enforcing it. This isn't just corruption. It's a coordinated effort to take control of the city." Harris shook his head. "But why? What's the endgame?" Thomas pointed to a line in the document labeled Phase 3 Implementation. "Whatever Phase 3 is, it's their final move. If we don't stop it, they'll own everything: real estate, infrastructure, politics. The entire city will be under their thumb." The next morning, Thomas convened the team. The mood was somber but determined. Lopez pinned a map to the evidence board, marking key locations tied to Project Dominion. "These blueprints outline major construction projects," Lopez explained. "But they don't make sense. Some of them are in abandoned areas. Others overlap with existing infrastructure. It's like they're building something, but not for public use. Or they're hiding something," Harris added. "This isn't about improving the city. It's about consolidating power." Thomas studied the map, his mind racing. "We need to figure out what Phase 3 is. If we can stop it, we dismantle the machine." Lopes handed him a folder. "There's one site that stands out, a warehouse near the industrial district. It's listed as a storage facility, but the payments tied to it don't match up. They're funneling millions into it." "That's our next move," Thomas said. "We raid the warehouse and find out what they're hiding." That evening, Thomas and the team prepared for the operation. The warehouse was heavily guarded, with security cameras and armed personnel patrolling the perimeter. It was clear the site was critical to Project Dominion. As they approached the area in unmarked vehicles, Thomas outlined the plan. "We go in fast and quiet. Secure the building, retrieve any evidence, and get out before reinforcements show up. If this is the heart of Dominion, they won't let it go without a fight." The team nodded, their determination evident. They were ready. Under the cover of darkness, the team breached the warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of machinery and the sharp smell of chemicals. Rows of crates lined the walls, each stamped with the logo of Westford Dynamics. "Spread out," Thomas ordered. "Find anything that ties this to Dominion." Harris pried open one of the crates, revealing stacks of cash wrapped in plastic. "This isn't just a storage facility. It's a laundering operation." Lopez called out from across the room. "You're going to want to see this." Thomas hurried over to where she stood, staring at a large control panel embedded in the wall. Monitors displayed schematics and surveillance footage of various locations across the city. "This is how they're monitoring everything," Lopez said. "Real estate transactions, political meetings, even law enforcement activity. They've got eyes everywhere." Thomas's stomach turned. This isn't just about money. They're controlling the city from here. As the team gathered evidence, a sudden alarm blared, the sound echoing through the warehouse. Thomas' blood ran cold. They had tripped a silent alarm. "Move," he shouted. "They're coming." The team scrambled to secure the evidence as the sound of vehicles approached outside. Moments later, armed men stormed the warehouse, their weapons trained on the officers. Gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through the crates and walls. Thomas and the team returned fire, taking cover behind whatever they could find. "We're pinned down," Harris shouted. "We need backup." Thomas ducked behind a metal beam, his mind racing. They couldn't hold out forever, but they couldn't leave without the evidence either. He glanced at the control panel, an idea forming. "Lopez," he called out. "Can you pull the data from that panel?" "I'll try," she shouted back, dodging gunfire as she made her way to the controls. Lopez worked quickly, her fingers flying over the keyboard as bullets ricocheted around her. "I'm copying everything, but it's going to take a minute." "We don't have a minute," Harris yelled, firing at the advancing attackers. Thomas covered her, taking down two of the gunmen as they tried to flank the team. "Hurry, Lopez." Finally, the monitor blinked, indicating the data transfer was complete. Lopez grabbed the drive and ran back to Thomas. "Got it. Fall back," Thomas ordered. "We're getting out of here." The team fought their way to the exit, narrowly escaping as reinforcements arrived. Outside, they piled into their vehicles, speeding away as the warehouse erupted in flames behind them. "They torched it," Harris said, his voice grim. "They're wiping out anything we didn't grab." Thomas held up the drive Lopez had retrieved. "But they didn't get this, and it's going to bring them down." Back at the precinct, the team examined the data. It contained detailed plans for Project Dominion, including key locations, financial records, and a list of names. At the top of the list was a name they hadn't seen before: Senator David Rourke. "Rourke," Lopez said, her eyes widening. "He's one of the most powerful politicians in the state. If he's behind this..." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Then we're not just dealing with city corruption anymore. This goes all the way to the top." The team fell silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. They had uncovered the core of the machine, but taking it down would require more than they had ever faced before. Thomas stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. "We've come too far to back down now. Dominion is falling, no matter what it takes." The name Senator David Rourke loomed on the evidence board like a shadow over everything they had uncovered. Thomas stared at it, his mind reeling. Rourke was a national figure, a man with a pristine public image, but the files tied him directly to Project Dominion. If they were going to bring him down, they needed irrefutable proof. The team gathered around the table in the precinct's secure conference room. Harris spread out the documents and maps retrieved from the warehouse. "This connects Rourke to Dominion, but it's not enough to take him to court. He'll claim plausible deniability. We need more." Thomas nodded. "Rourke's been funding this operation, but he's careful. If we're going to nail him, we need to catch him in the act." Lopez leaned forward, pointing to a series of transactions in the data. "These payments funnel through shell companies tied to a property under Dominion's control. A luxury retreat just outside the city. It's secluded and off the radar." Harris raised an eyebrow. A retreat. What's there? According to the files, it's a meeting point for high-level players in the operation, Lopez explained. If Work's involved, he'll be there. Thomas's mind raced. If we can get inside and record their conversations, we'll have what we need. Harris frowned. That's a big risk. If they spot us, we're dead. It's a risk we have to take, Thomas said firmly. This is our chance to expose the entire machine. The next evening, the team prepped for the operation. Dressed in plain clothes, they drove to the retreat in an unmarked van. The property was nestled in a dense forest, the only access a narrow road flanked by tall trees. From a distance, the retreat looked like a luxurious estate, its lights glowing against the dark sky. Lopes parked the van a mile from the property, and the team proceeded on foot, using the cover of darkness to avoid detection. Thomas led the way, his pulse steady but his mind alert. He couldn't afford any mistakes. As they approached the retreat, they could hear faint voices and the clinking of glasses. The main house was surrounded by security, men in suits patrolling the perimeter with earpieces and concealed weapons. Thomas motioned for the team to stop. We'll split up. Harris, Lopez, you cover the front. I'll go around back and see if there's another way in. Thomas moved quietly, circling the property until he found a side door partially concealed by a line of hedges. He picked the lock, slipping inside undetected. The interior of the house was opulent, with polished floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork adorning the walls, but the voices drew his attention. He followed the sound to a large dining room, where a group of men sat around a long table. At the head of the table was Senator Work. He looked composed, his suit immaculate, as he addressed the group. This city is just the beginning, Work said, his voice calm but commanding. Dominion will give us control over the resources, the infrastructure, and the political system. Once Phase 3 is complete, nothing can stop us. Thomas's stomach churned. He activated a small recording device hidden in his pocket, capturing every word. Work continued, outlining plans to manipulate elections, seize key real estate, and expand Dominion's influence across the state. One of the men spoke up. What about the investigation? Bradley and his team are getting close. Work smirked. Let them. By the time they piece everything together, it'll be too late. Besides, we have contingencies in place. Thomas's jaw tightened. He knew the risks of being discovered, but he couldn't leave without the evidence. He needed to hear more. Suddenly, a hand clammed down on his shoulder. Thomas spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. A security guard glared at him, his weapon drawn. "Who the hell are you?" the guard demanded. Thomas acted quickly, elbowing the man in the ribs and knocking the weapon aside. The commotion alerted the group in the dining room. Chairs scraped against the floor as the men stood, their faces a mix of shock and fury. "Get him," Work barked. Thomas bolted, weaving through the house as more guards appeared, their shouts echoing through the halls. He dodged furniture and ducked into a side room, slamming the door behind him. Through his earpiece, he called to the team. "I've been made. Get ready to extract." Lopez's voice came through, tense but focused. "We're on it. Front door's too hot. We'll meet you at the north tree line." Thomas smashed a window with his elbow, climbing out just as the guards burst into the room. He sprinted across the lawn, gunfire erupting behind him. The sound of bullets ripping through the air was deafening, but he didn't stop. Ahead, he spotted Harris and Lopez crouched near the tree line, their weapons drawn. "Come on," Harris shouted. Thomas dove into the cover of the trees as the guards closed in. Harris and Lopez provided suppressing fire, forcing the guards to retreat. The team made their way back to the van, hearts pounding and lungs burning. Back at the precinct, Thomas handed the recording to Harris. "This is it," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "This ties Work directly to Dominion." Lopes plugged the device into her laptop, playing back the senator's incriminating words. The room fell silent as the team listened. "This is enough to take him down," Harris said. "We need to get this to the DA immediately." Thomas nodded, but his gut told him the fight wasn't over. Work wouldn't go down quietly. and the machine would strike back harder than ever. As the team prepared to move, Thomas's phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "You have the proof. Now watch your back. Work isn't done with you." Thomas read the message, his jaw tightening. The war with Dominion wasn't over. It was just entering its most dangerous phase. The precinct was abuzz with activity as Thomas and his team prepared to deliver the damning evidence to District Attorney Morgan. The recording of Senator Work's meeting was their ace, the irrefutable proof they needed to bring down the entire Dominion operation. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the lion's den. Harris glanced at Thomas, his expression grim. "You think they'll come after us?" "They already have," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "But this time we're ready." The team loaded the evidence into an armored vehicle, escorted by patrol cars for added security. Thomas rode alongside Lopez, his hand resting on the holstered weapon at his side. "This feels too easy," Lopez muttered. "Rourke won't just let this happen." Thomas nodded, scanning the streets as the convoy moved through the city. "Stay alert. If they make a move, we need to be ready." Halfway to the DA's office, the convoy came to an abrupt stop. A black SUV had pulled across the road, blocking their path. Thomas's instincts screamed danger. "Ambush," he shouted. "Defensive positions." Before anyone could react, masked men emerged from nearby alleyways, armed and ready. Gunfire erupted, shattering windows and sparking chaos. Thomas dove out of the vehicle, taking cover behind a concrete barrier. "They're after the evidence," Harris shouted over the commotion. Lopes clutched the briefcase containing the recording, her knuckles white. "We can't let them take it." Thomas assessed the situation quickly. The attackers were well coordinated, pinning down the convoy with suppressing fire. But they hadn't counted on the team's resolve. "Harris, Lopez, cover me," Thomas ordered. Under the hail of bullets, Thomas made his way to the armored vehicle, where the backup copies of the evidence were stored. He grabbed the drives, tucking them into his jacket. The attackers couldn't take what they couldn't find. The firefight raged on, but the sound of approaching sirens signaled reinforcements. The attackers began to retreat, their plan foiled. As the last of them disappeared into the shadows, Thomas emerged from cover, breathing heavily. "Everyone okay?" he called out. Harris nodded, wiping blood from a shallow graze on his arm. "They didn't get the evidence." Lopes held up the briefcase. "We've still got it." Thomas's chest tightened with relief, but his resolve hardened. "They're desperate. That means we're close." When they arrived at the DA's office, Morgan was waiting, her face a mix of relief and determination. "I heard what happened. Are you all right?" "We're fine," Thomas said. "And we've got what you need." He handed over the recording along with the backup drives. Morgan listened to the recording, her expression darkening with each word. "This is enough to indict Rourke and everyone tied to Dominion," she said. "But we'll need to move fast. They'll try to destroy any remaining evidence." Within hours, arrest warrants were issued for Senator Rourke, Marion Brooks, and several other key figures in the Dominion operation. The arrests were carried out in a highly publicized series of raids, with media outlets covering the takedown live. Thomas watched the footage from the precinct, his expression stoic. The machine was crumbling, its gears grinding to a halt, but he knew the fight wasn't over. Later that evening, Thomas received a final text from the unknown number. "You did it. But Dominion isn't gone. It's just wounded. Stay vigilant." Thomas stared at the message, the weight of the words settling over him. He didn't know who the informant was or why they had helped, but he owed them a debt of gratitude. In the days that followed, the city began to change. With Dominion dismantled, a wave of reform swept through the government and police department. Thomas and his team were hailed as heroes, but he remained grounded. As he sat in his office one evening, Cheryl walked in, a warm smile on her face. "You did it, Tom. You brought them down." He nodded, his gaze distant. "We won this battle, but there will be others." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "And when they come, I know you'll be ready." Thomas looked at her, his resolve unwavering. The machine had been exposed, its operators brought to justice. But corruption was a hydra, and he knew more heads would rise. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, but Thomas Bradley had proven one thing: no one, not even the most powerful, was above the law.